AuthorTube channel. My name is Bobbi Holmes and I am the USA Today Bestselling Author of the Paranormal Cozy Mystery Series, Haunting Danielle. And I also write under the pen name Anna J. McIntyre. Today I wanted to discuss 6 rules or tips for writing and publishing that are very commonly given, and I happen to disagree with them. So let's go over what these 6 are and why I happen to disagree with them. The first rule or suggestion or tip that I am going to discuss involves dialogue tags. Now, as we all know, we need dialogue tags so we know which character happens to be talking at the time. Now, dialogue tags aren't quite as critical if you just have 2 people talking. You don't have to use them as frequently, but if you have 3 or more characters engaged in a conversation, you need something to show who is saying what. Now, one thing that some new writers tend to do is they throw out words like, instead of saying said, they want to be creative and they say ejaculate. And well, ejaculate instead of said is considered kind of amateurish. And so a lot of the writing rules involving dialogue tags has shifted towards just use said. And I've heard that a lot. And one of the reasons they say is just use said normally is because said is a word that when you read it, your eye sort of becomes, you don't see it after a while. It helps you figure out who is saying what in the paragraph or in the conversation that they're having. But you tend to, when you're reading it, your eyes sort of skip over it, so you're not always seeing these repeated said, so it's not that big of a deal. You become sort of blind to them. Helps you, do what it needs to do, but it doesn't become that obvious or intrusive. So why do I disagree with the advice to use primarily said instead of other words? I'm certainly not advocating using ejaculate instead of said, but why am I opposed to using said more than anything else? Well, the reason is quite simple, and it has to do with audiobooks. Publishing has changed a lot in the last few years, and the new big trend is audiobooks. And I realize audiobooks have been around for a long time. I read audiobooks 20, 30 years ago, or listened to audiobooks anyway. Usually from tapes that I rented from the library. Now audiobooks are becoming very, very popular, and more books are being turned into audiobooks. All my Haunting Danielle books are in audiobooks. My Colson family, which has 5 books in the series, will be released totally in audiobook this year. In fact, the first 4 books are already out. The last one will be put out the end of this month. So why does it have anything? Why does using said is not a good thing when we're talking about audiobooks? Not long ago, I listened to an audiobook, and this particular author obviously embraced the belief that you should primarily use said in your dialogue tags instead of some other word. Well, unfortunately, it was really annoying in an audiobook because it was he said, she said, Sam said, Ted said, Ed said, just one said after another, and it was really annoying. And I don't imagine that when she read this or her editors read it, they really thought about audiobooks when they did it. They have to listen to it in order to see how annoying it really is. So, unfortunately, when we write our books, we don't necessarily write them for audiobooks, unless, I suppose if an author wanted to, they could have, 2 different drafts, one for audio and one for the book. But, that kind of misses the whole point when you buy an audiobook and it's an unabridged, that's supposed to be just like the book, the paper book or the ebook. So if you're doing an unabridged audiobook, you really can't do that. And plus, that would be a lot of wasted time and work, and it would be a pain in the butt. Rethink this whole said thing, and it doesn't mean you have to flip in weird words, but perhaps use more action tags, a little bit more creative but not zany dialogue tags. But I just think that recommendation or that rule or that writing tip to just sticks to said mostly, it doesn't really work when you go over to audio. And there's another problem with dialogue tags. If you just say, well, I'm just going to take them out, and people will figure it out who's saying what. We have to be careful about that. I have had situations where I've listened to an audiobook and I'm familiar with the book, and I realize that narrator has gotten confused. And the line they're reading, because they're changing their voice for the different characters, and the line that they're reading is not really by the character, the voice that they're using, it's another character. So even the narrator can get confused if the dialogue tags are not clear. So that's something to consider too. You have to be really clear because your narrator may get confused when they're reading the book and read the wrong line and the wrong character name. And for the reader that's listening to the book, they get really annoyed listening to the same word being repeated over and over and over and over again. So that is my take on said. Number 2 on my list has to do with those writing courses that you can take. There are many online courses often given by your favorite author, or there's blog posts that you can read, or YouTube videos, all kinds of information out there that tell you the right way to write a book. Well, the fact of the matter is there is no one right way. The only right way is what works for you. So it's great to take those different online courses. It's great to read as many blog posts as you can to get different input and different ideas. But you need to be careful not to find yourself believing that one is the way and trying to fit into that one, and if it doesn't really fit. I mean, you might be, the round peg and trying to squeeze into that square hole, and it's just not gonna work. So you need to find out what works for you. Some people need to outline, some people need to, just fly with, their imagination and, let's see what the story unfolds. So figure out what works for you, look around, read all the different advice, and then don't settle on something just because you really like that author or you really like their work. Settle what works for you. Number 3 on the list has to do with the advice you have to write every single day. Now, I understand where that's coming from. It's about creating a habit of writing, and there are many people out there that put off writing, like, oh, I'm going to write a book someday, or I want to be a writer, but they never sit down and write. And to be a writer, you have to write. But does that mean you have to write every single day? No, I don't think it's really about writing every day. It's about establishing a habit. And for me, it's about a schedule. Now, I don't necessarily write every single day. And I know a lot of authors that don't. Now, I guess in some ways I do. I'll, send off a blog post, or maybe I'll, comment on Facebook. So technically speaking, that could be writing every day. But actually sitting down and doing some serious writing, I don't necessarily do that every day. But what I do is I schedule. Now, I put out 4 books a year, and so that means I have to schedule. I just can't write when I feel like it, because that's not going to work. That's not going to get the books written. So for me, when I have a book that's coming out, I know about how many chapters it's going to be, and I figure out, what I'm going to write each day, and I have a date when I start and when I finish. And so for me, it's all about scheduling my time and cutting that time out for me to write. For other people's, it may be simply sitting down each day at a certain time and writing. Maybe that would work for them. Just like I said in the previous section, it has to be what works for you. For some people, writing every single day, that works for them, but it's not necessarily the only way or the right way. But you do have to come into some sort of a habit, and you have to actually do it. The next one on my list has to do more with self-publishing as opposed to writing. I said that these were the different rules or tips involved with writing and self-publishing. This particular one has to do with self-publishing. Now, this is a rule that, it's not a common rule with a lot of people, I don't think, but it's one that I heard this very popular YouTube personality. He's an author. And he told his audience emphatically that if you do not already have a platform, do not self-publish, you will fail. And he went on and on and on and on and on about this. Well, that's such a bunch of baloney. Now, having a platform before you self-publish will definitely give you a boost. It will definitely help. But not having one does not mean that you're going to fail. I'm an example of that. I certainly did not have a platform when I first started self-publishing back in 2011, but really I got going in 2012. I didn't have a platform, and I'm doing pretty well right now. So, and I have lots of writer friends in the same boat. Now, if you already have a platform established, that's going to give you a boost. That's great. So that particular, I don't know if it's a rule or tip, that not to self-publish if you don't already have a platform, it's a bunch of baloney. And now to the next one. The next one on my list involves genre hopping. And I'm sort of on the fence about this because there is some validity to this particular rule, but then it's a rule that you need to know when to break it. Now, the rule basically is if you're a new and established author and you're going with one genre, stick with that and build that platform. Don't hop all over the place, because it's going to make it more difficult to establish your business. On the flip side, the author side of you want to write what you want to write. But putting that aside, because that has nothing to do with building your business, You have to also know when is the right time to genre hop, because sometimes genre hopping can actually be good for your publishing business. It was for mine. I wrote under Anna J. McIntyre, I did romance, and I had a relatively success, not huge, but I was doing okay compared to a lot of self-published authors. But it wasn't where my heart was anymore, and so I had to jump to something I felt more passionate and I wanted to write and I thought was more fun, and it was something new I wanted to explore. And it proved that was the Haunting Danielle series. And that proved to be an extremely smart business decision. So there are some writing rules and tips like, don't genre hop, that you have to know when is the right time to break that rule. Sometimes you shouldn't break it. Sometimes you're just going to hurt yourself by genre hopping all over the place. But other times it can be the right thing to do. When I decided to do this segment on popular writing and publishing tips that I disagree on, I posted a question in one of my writer groups on Facebook, a private Facebook group I belong to, last night. And it's a group I've belonged to for about 8 years now. And the members of the group are some wonderful authors, people that I really trust and value their opinion. So one of the very common ones that popped up with a number of them, quite passionately in fact, was the rule or advice, write what you know. Now I thought that was pretty ironic because that happened to be on my list already, but not that way. You see, recently it has become sort of a common popular trend for authors to pipe up and say they disagree with the advice, write what you know. That's something that's kind of a new trend. If you look around, you'll see different blog posts or YouTube videos discussing this, how that's, one of those common writing advices that's not really a good piece of advice. Well, I kind of disagree with them. And my dear friends over at the retreat, I kind of disagree with you too, and let me explain why. Now, first of all, I think it has to do with misunderstanding the rule a little bit. I don't think the rule or the suggestion, it's not really a rule, more the suggestion or the writing tip, write what you know, I don't think it ever was something that you were supposed to embrace for your entire writing career. I don't think that's what it was about. I think it was a piece of advice given primarily to new authors. Right after I first started reading more and more blog posts or comments from authors where write what you know was a bad piece of advice, I happened to watch a gentleman's YouTube video on this very topic, and he was an author and he was quite emphatic about how it was a crappy piece of advice. So I listened to his YouTube rant, and that's kind of what it was. His first experience with Write What You Know had to do with his very first and only writing class he had taken years and years ago. Apparently, his instructor had given them some writing assignments in it was a very basic beginning writing course, and they were supposed to write what they know about their own life experiences. Well, his premise was, he felt that most of us are pretty boring, and if we just write about ourselves, it's going to be a boring read. And so he was very proud of himself. He created this whole fantasy story and made up this big involved thing, really impressed his teacher. He wrote about somebody he really wasn't in a life. He just created all the stuff. And so his feeling was that as a writer, our job is to make up stuff, which is true. But writing is about learning in different stages. Like everything you learn, you have different steps to go. And I kind of believe that the write what you know has to do when you first are starting in. I think this particular gentleman, the point of write what you know totally went over his head. The write what you know is about allowing you to focus on the craft of writing, not the part of writing that has to do with your imagination where you're making up stuff. Because yeah, we all make up stuff. I write about ghosts. I have never had any personal experiences with ghosts. But the point about writing what you know is when you're a new writer and you're learning your craft, it helps you. It's a tool that you can use. Let me give you an example about writing what you know, helping a new writer learn their craft. Let's say you're taking a writing course and your teacher says they want you to write a scene. Everybody in the class is to write a scene of walking down the beach in the evening. Now, the teacher also tells the class they want the scene to be realistic. They don't want any spaceships landing on the beach or the beach opening up and you falling into a volcano or something. Let's not go there. They want you to write a realistic scene of walking down the beach. Now, a lot of people might think that sounds boring, but somebody that's a really good writer or that they really want to stretch those writing muscles might be able to turn that into something very poignant and beautiful. Now, the people that have actually experienced on a beach, quote unquote, writing what you know, they will have more tools to draw from. For example, they will know what it smells like at the ocean. They will know what it feels like to walk in the sand. It's very different to walk in the sand barefoot as opposed with tennis shoes, with sand getting in your shoes, or with flip-flops on, and how your legs feel heavy walking in the sand. So if you've never been to the beach yourself, you may not be aware of how it smells, what it's like to walk in the sand, what it sounds like, how the ocean breeze feels when it, flies against your face. There's all those things that you experience when something happens to you that will help you enrich that story. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily write exactly your experience of walking down the beach, but you can pull from your experience and make a richer story. The very first book of fiction that I ever published, Lessons, which is now Colson's Lessons, wasn't the very first book I ever wrote, but it's the very first book that I ever published. So when I wrote that book, I intentionally made the main character, Alexandra, my age. I had her born in my year, graduate from high school the same time I did. Now, she wasn't me by any means. Alexandra is not me. She just happens to share my generation. The reason I did that is it made it easy for me to write the characters because I experienced what it was like to be a high school student back in those days. And I knew what it was like to be a young mother at the time she was a young mother because I too had, experienced that. I had children and raising them around the same time frame as hers. In fact, I think I made her son about the same age as my son. And I didn't do that because I was writing about me. I did that because it was just easier to be able to, when I was thinking about dialogue for the son, I could think of my own son and things that he would do or say. And the same with her, the kind of clothes she wore, the bell bottoms. I didn't have to do a lot of research. It was easier, actually. Another thing I did with Lessons, which is now Colson's Lessons, is I made the setting in a town called Colson. Well, that particular imaginary town is patterned very much after Lake Havasu City, Arizona, where I grew up at. Lake Havasu was founded by an industrialist who bought a section of land from the railroad and the state, I believe it was, and then they developed a town, and I was there in the very early years and watched this town grow up. So for me, Colson's was sort of like that. There were some differences. For instance, in my book, they named the town after the founder, Colson. In Lake Havasu City, it is not named, obviously. The founder was not Lake Havasu City. The founder was Robert McCulloch, but Main Street is named after McCulloch. So he did give his name to Main Street. And plus another thing is in Lake Havasu, McCulloch didn't really stay in the town like in Colson's. They become very big parts of the town, are always there. Whereas McCulloch, he went off developing other things. So he had a presence here in his family. Some of his family lives here. But that was not very much like the book. But there was parts that I did kind of borrow from. So I was writing what I knew in the sense that I understood it was possible for an industrialist to build his own town, that he could buy land, build a city on it. So for me, I was writing what I knew in that early book to help the book become a little bit more believable, to make it easier for me to write. So I think that's Write What You Know is what that's about. Now, as we go along as writers, we then branch out. We write about other things. We do research to learn more about other things that have our interest that we want to write about. And a lot of it has to do with imagination, but it's not all imagination. And even as we are more seasoned authors and we continue to write, I personally still borrow things from my life and put them into my books. I just think sometimes it enriches them and makes them a little bit more interesting. And sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. For example, in my Haunting Danielle series, Walt, the character who you first meet as the Ghost of Marlowe House in the very first book, he was born around the same time as my Grandpa Pete. And my Grandpa Pete once told me a story about how when he was a young boy, him and his friends smoked buggy whips, and he talked about, the trouble they got into and what the guy said to him when they caught him. So I took that particular story and I gave it to Walt in one of the books when he's sharing with Danielle or somebody in the story about his life, because he was from the same era as my grandfather was. So those are times where you kind of borrow from from your own life and stick it, and that's kind of like writing what you know in a way. So I wanted to rethink that, and so write what you know is not a bad rule. And I think for new writers, it is a really great way to kind of jumpstart the writing. And if you just say, oh, forget that rule, new writers, I think you're kind of hurting them, because I think a new writer really benefits by starting out, learning your craft, writing what you know. Well, that about wraps it up today, what I have to say on rules, on writing and publishing rules that I kind of don't quite buy into. And it's not really that they're necessarily bad rules or bad pieces of advice. I think what I'm really trying to say is don't be too rigid with any of them. All of them have something valuable that can contribute to your writing. Like, for instance, yes, having a platform first will help your publishing business, but not having one doesn't mean you're going to fail. And yes, it's a good idea not to go crazy with the dialogue tags and use something really goofy, but you don't have to always use said, and sometimes it's not really a good thing to do when you think about audiobooks. Or the same with writing what you know. Yes, I think writing what you know is excellent advice for a brand new author. It helps them focus on the craft of writing while using their experiences to feed the story. So all of these things are rules and tips that, yeah, maybe they can help, but don't go crazy on them either way. So that's about all I have to say today, except for please stay safe and write on.